I do want to recognize that Paul Van Donkelaar, who is the Associate Vice Principal Research on the Okanagan campus, is able to join us for a brief period of time. And although we're kind of in the middle of this reframing and we're not yet to pivoting, I'm wondering, given the time that you have, Paul, if you could give us some insight on where we're at with kind of research resumption.
Sure. Thanks, Jen, and thanks for putting on this workshop. It's been great to hear some of the discussion so far. So as many of you likely have heard, both campuses are in the process of resuming on-campus research in a very restricted way. It really is going to be limited to researchers and creative scholars who need access to facilities that are only available on campus in order to do their work. So an example might be a creative scholar who needs studio space, or someone in applied science who has very specialized equipment in a lab that's the only way they can do their research. Same with bench sciences. So for the most part, folks who can continue to do work remotely, even if it's in a restricted way, as we've just been talking, you should continue to do so. And so it's definitely challenging. One of the things, the main driving principle behind the research resumption process is to keep everyone safe while resuming as much research as possible on campus. And in order to do that, we need to make some choices and be able to justify those decisions to ourselves. In terms of graduate students and postdocs, one aspect that we're considering in those decisions, or faculties are considering in those decisions, is how close they are to finishing and moving on to some other position. So if you have a PhD student who's, just needs to do one more set of data collection or one more experiment that requires access to facilities on campus, then that person might get a slightly higher priority than someone who's just starting out and doing some pilot work. And like I mentioned, at the end of the day, our main concern is safety. It revolves around basically safety plans being developed for the research spaces and the associated common spaces within buildings. And then the ability of building operations and custodial services to be able to maintain that safety in terms of signage, so that people can be reminded about physical distancing, washing their hands, and cleaning of high-use surfaces on a regular basis. So it's definitely a challenging time right now. It's definitely a complex situation, and we hope to get through the next little while and get some people back on campus, and then hopefully later on in the summer increase that amount again, assuming that there's no change in the public health situation.
Thanks, Paul. Is there any, although this is a supervisory workshop, we truly understand the interaction between research resumption and your role as a supervisor. Are there any, I recognize Paul doesn't have a lot of time, questions for Paul that you might feel you need addressed in your supervisory relationship that he could take a stab at for us?
See, Bridget has a question around allowing students to do research abroad, and that definitely is in that gray zone of research resumption, especially with international travel, where they might be going to different jurisdictions that have different public health situations and requirements. Definitely that would be one factor that would be considered, and then also travel advisories in terms of, is it safe to travel to that particular area of the world. Right now, with this particular research resumption component, we're really limiting it to on-campus access to facilities. If travel for research or fieldwork in general can be done while maintaining all the relevant safety precautions, i.e. physical distancing and not coming into close contact with other folks, then that becomes a possibility. We have a task force that's working through loosening some of the restrictions on field work, and so that's hopefully some recommendations will be coming out of that in terms of how a person would seek approval to do that. Again, it's an ongoing and rapidly evolving situation that we're trying to stay on top of. And again, finding that sweet spot between allowing people to continue their work without putting them in any sort of danger.
There's another one there, Paul. Can you see that?
Yeah, so physical library resources. So again, that's a great question. Both libraries on both campuses are setting up a system for scholars who need access to in-print only books, so archival material, for example, for their scholarly work, to be accessible via basically a curbside pickup, so minimizing the physical contact with library staff and scholars. So that's definitely something that will be happening. At one level, you can consider that to be an on-campus resource that's only available on campus. Right? And so if you need that in order to do your work, libraries on both campuses are working through the procedures to allow that to occur in as safe a way as possible.
All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about pivoting in a pandemic. We've talked about, existent principles, the 7 of them that Teresa started with. We identified some ways to reframe our current approaches and reflect both upon us as educators and teachers, as well as looking at students in a different way and their learning. But how do we pivot? So I'm going to share some experience with my area of research, which is health science, and then Teresa's going to share a little bit of hers. So I'm positioning an example here, a real example, of potentially having the need to alter a question or look at things a little bit different from the perspective of statistical power. So when we went on research curtailment, there are students out there that might have been halfway through their data collection. And all of a sudden now they've had to pause. It could be, for me, it's in human research and potentially in a clinical population. So what do? It's a master's student approaching completion. We've now been out of the lab since the middle of March. Well, other ways to look at this as the approach we're taking is looking at things from altering our question and finding a collaborative way to maybe take that half of our data sample and ask them a research-based question that we can send through a survey. So instead of finishing up the last 15 subjects, maybe we go back to the last 15 subjects that we collected already, or maybe those that we didn't, and develop a survey that may not allow us to get physical evidence, but might allow us to get qualitative evidence that supports the physical evidence we've already gathered. That's one potential approach. The other potential approach is finding those statisticians that might be within your unit, around campus, or between campuses, and say, hey, I've got this data set of 15 and I need 30. And we tried this. What can we model out? What do we know about these 15 and the variability that's about them? And we build models that we now get to use instead of actually doubling our data set. So these are different approaches that we've taken. Lisa's going to speak to some of this from the perspective of, you've got ethics, you're partway through, now what do you do and how do you go about changing your ethics? The other element I want to keep in mind with my example here, with respect to the master's student thesis, is what are the principles that a student needs to have to gain a master's degree? And keep those to heart, discuss them with the student, and discuss them with the committee, because it's really about deeper knowledge, critically and systematically evaluating the literature. It's conscious approaches to ethics and the aspects of research. That part might have already been gained. It's the capability to clearly present and discuss conclusions. They may not be the conclusions that you aimed for, but there still are conclusions to be found. And then convey that in both a written and an oral format. Can a student achieve those goals? And that's what a master's thesis is about. Let's remember that a master's thesis is not about having sufficient statistical power to publish a peer-reviewed journal article. So if we separate those two, it creates a little bit more flexibility and conversation between yourself, the student, their goals, and what the committee actually sees as well. I know Teresa's going to share a different perspective, and then we're going to invite Lisa to give us some insight in how to go about this from an ethical review standpoint, and hopefully hear a little bit from you as well. Teresa?
Okay. So I just wanted to give an example from social science, and I'm in the middle of this myself. So I thought I'd just give my example, but you all probably have similar examples, or many of you in social sciences. I have a recent SHRC study that I really collaboratively developed with a PhD student, and it's on literature, mobilities, and civic engagement. And the core aspect of our work was to go into probably an 8th or 9th grade classroom. Well, that's not going to happen anytime soon. So, but we did have another aspect of the study, which was to work with practicing and pre-service teachers around the same kinds of concepts. What's interesting here is that one aspect of the work is about the importance of public space in our lives and how we navigate public spaces, and so this pandemic has just put that into relief. So when we did some work with our students right as we went online in a course I was teaching, we got fascinating data because people couldn't go and interact in public space, and teachers and students couldn't be in the classroom together, and so people had very strong reactions and really interesting things to say about it. The problem I have now is I have to make some decisions that involve a student who's being funded by this project. So what do we do? And I'm trying to be both reassuring and very flexible. So one possibility is for us to keep working with teachers in the online context as we continue to teach, and then wait to get into the classrooms. And I'm not going to ask any school in the fall, even if they're back. I'm probably not even going to ask a school this next spring, because teachers are going to be overwhelmed no matter what the situation is. So what happens then when you really can't move forward with the study that you had planned? And so we've had to go back into ethics and redo the teacher aspect of it in the virtual context, and create maybe some new approaches to new methodologies that are more consistent with a virtual context. So I'm just thinking that there's probably many researchers across the campus who are having to make these kinds of decisions, and having to pivot. And so I don't know in the end whether we will ever even do our school piece, or whether we will do a rich study around practicing and pre-service teachers, or if we will. And I've already told her she's probably going to be here a year longer than maybe we had planned if she's committed to doing the classroom study. So there's lots of decisions that we have to really have a lot of communication about, and reassurance and decision making. As I was thinking about some of these issues, I came across this amazing resource that some of you might find interesting. And I'm going to share this, and I'm going to knock off this.
Go for it.
And it's called...
We can see it now. Thanks, Teresa.
Okay. It's called Doing Fieldwork in a Pandemic. And I saw Susan Cox was on here. I think there's some interesting stuff in thinking about role play and all kinds of things that you would normally do face-to-face and now have to do virtually. So what they've done here is they've crowdsourced a whole list of methodologies and different ways that you can do social science research online, from reenactments to diaries and journaling, photo and voice elicitation. Look at this. There's just so many. And many of them have research articles associated with them that you can read on how to do it, and they're all available virtually. So I think that we're all going to have to be much more creative. Those of us in the social sciences who rely on human subjects, we're going to probably have to be a lot more creative and innovative in how we continue to do the kind of work we hope to do. And I think, I don't know if it's next or soon, we're going to be asking you if you have examples of situations where you're creating more innovative and different sorts of methodologies. And is that on the next page that we ask you that? I can't remember.
I think it is. I want to highlight as well. I'm also going to apologize that moment of the background noise. I'm going to step out because you might hear my dog whining in the background to get out of the room when the door is locked. So I apologize. I do want to draw attention to Susan Cox posted that there's also a recorded webinar of Deborah Lupton talking about how the document was developed through an in vivo website. So we'll find that information, and when we send the slides out, we'll also share that with you. So you are right in that. We're going to now have a group discussion about sharing our experiences, and we'd like to hear from others. And I'm going to let the dog out. So Teresa.
Okay, yeah. So if you could, you can raise your hand if you have an idea or a thought, if you've done something. We invite you to raise your hand and share it with us. I'm going to give the instructional wait time to see before I move on. Just want to see if anybody wants to share what they're doing. And I don't want to put you on the spot, Susan, but I'm wondering if you wanted to talk about the project you're doing.
The blue hand is if you go to the click on your participants button, you should be able to see all a list of participants. And at the bottom, if you scroll down to the very bottom, you'll see some options, and there will be a blue hand there. I think there's like voting cues, yes and no, elements like that. So there we have it.
There we go. Susan and Catherine. Good. So Susan, do you want to go first, and then we'll go to Catherine?
Oh, sure. Thanks, Teresa. I think you're referring to the project using theater, but I have another project that is maybe relevant in terms of talking about pivoting social science research to. The project using theater that Teresa raised is a project funded through the Teaching Learning Enhancement Fund and the Inclusivity, Diversity, and Equity Fund, where we're looking at creating, first of all, this goes back a while, we first created live theater dramatized scenes about graduate supervision and used them as prompts for groups of faculty, staff, and students, graduate students, to talk about important issues in graduate supervision. And it was quite a novel approach to using theater in that we would show a scene, and then we had the theater arranged in small groups around the room and a facilitator at each table. And so each scene led to a period of discussion and then another scene. And it was quite provocative. And we're now moving with the new funding into creating a video that uses dramatized scenes, and we'll be piloting that, we hope, fairly soon. And I want to acknowledge a lot of the work that Jackie Brinkman and Teresa Rogers and Murphy and others in GNPS have done thus far on the project. So we're moving into some really interesting experiments with a new script and figuring out how to film this video using all of the appropriate methods of social distancing, and then figuring out how to pilot the use of the video in online discussions. So that's going to be really interesting, and I'm really excited about it, and hope that at some point we can invite members of this group to participate in a discussion of that new video as it becomes available.
Thank you, Susan. And Catherine?
Hi, I've actually found this discussion very interesting, and I think I'm just going to check that you can hear me. Can you hear me? Hello? Yes, you can hear me. Good.
Yeah,
we
can.
I found this discussion very interesting. So I got a UBC program for undergraduate research experience grant from UBC to do an experiential in-person course in the Soyuz BC in May that got canceled because of COVID-19. And as I've listened to this discussion, this last bit of the discussion, it occurs to me that I think we're probably going to be vaccineless for May 2021. But as I'm listening to the discussion, I can hear ways that I could repackage this using technology and perhaps redistribute some of the funds from that grant to give people a somewhat more limited digital experience that can nevertheless be interactive. And since I've got enough lead time now, a full year, I think I'm going to start thinking very actively about it. And about, so it could be digital, experiential, Zoom, and it would also protect the elderly folks that we plan to interview in 2021 and then hopefully in person in 2022. I say enthusiastically, knowing full well that it takes about 4 years to develop a vaccine. But thank you, that was really, really helpful. So we're kind of rethinking how a humanist social scientist does field work is really helpful. We'll have to rethink the archival experiences too. There is some digitization. So this has been wonderfully helpful to help me think about how to reconfigure something that was intended as one thing but could conceivably become a rich experience in a different format.
Great, that's great. Thanks, Catherine.
And I think, Catherine, the other element here is as we're rethinking about what we've always done, it's a great learning opportunity to reframe what students expected and now create an opportunity for a different learning environment, perhaps collaboratively, just really opening some eyes. So it's a great way to actually engage in students in a different and meaningful way and potentially direct them into areas of research that they hadn't thought about or research approaches in the area that they had thought about. So I think that's a great point. Thanks, Catherine.
And then we have one more. We have Jonathan Little.
Hi, everyone. Yeah, so I thought I'd just share my, I do clinical research, clinical trials where we usually bring people in and take blood samples, and that obviously can't happen right now, but we've been trying to pivot as many of those studies as we can to be online or remote trials. So we are doing stuff now where we can do almost everything that we would measure in a regular blood sample with a blood spot. You take a participant takes a finger prick sample themselves, puts it on a filter paper, and can mail it back to the lab for us to analyze. We have students that had USRAs to do wet lab work who are now making recipe videos and instructional videos for how to take measurements yourself. And we essentially create these packages of the blood spot test, Bluetooth enabled scales to measure body weight and body composition, creating websites with all of the intervention materials so that we can send participants out a package and essentially remotely collect almost all the data that we normally would. So I think it's doable. It's challenging, but we've been able to convince a couple of funding agencies and sponsors that we can do this and keep some studies going for people. And the benefit of it, or what excites me, is that if we learn how to do this and do it properly, now we can recruit from all over Canada or the US or the world potentially for studies if we get good at this. So we're not just isolated to recruiting patients from Kelowna. So we're kind of taking it as a positive, and we'll see how it goes. It's not perfect, but it can be done, and the technology is out there to be able to change some studies that maybe you thought were totally not doable in the pandemic.
Thanks, John.
That's such a great point. I mean, there are. I know we're being a little bit Pollyanna, but there are real opportunities in this situation, and we are learning to do things differently. That's great.
Okay. I am gonna flip the slide here. Well, maybe I'll flip the slide. Okay, there's the slide. And Lisa, we invite you to join us and share some knowledge. And I'll also identify that I see Carolyn online here, popped into one of my little corner screens. Carolyn is the co-chair of I think it's still co-chair. I haven't checked recently. Yeah. I'm seeing some nods of the UBC BREB board on the Okanagan campus. So feel free to jump in at any point and add some insight from your lens as well, Carolyn. Thank you.
Thanks, Jen and Teresa, for inviting me to speak today. And yes, Carolyn, of course, you can pop in at any time. Just raise your blue hand and we'll turn it over to you. So, yeah, speaking of like pivoting and changing, it's definitely been quite an adventure so far on the research ethics side. Just have some common points to share, just to kind of give you an idea of what the current landscape is, where the landscape may be changing, and how the research ethics boards are reacting. first off, any COVID-related studies are having priority right now in the review process. It affects more the clinical research ethics side, but certainly on the behavioral research ethics side, we have seen a fair number of COVID-related studies. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that anything else is kind of put to the wayside. All the 6 REBs at UBC are reviewing research, new applications and amendments as normal. So no worries there. On the behavioral side here on campus, we're still within our same usual turnaround time of 4 to 6 weeks. That could change. So I always like to mention when I present to the grad students that they build in the ethics approval into their planning stage. The REBs are following UBC and provincial directives, of course, and so that's always changing. And so we're right now in a position of a little bit of not catch up, but getting up to speed with a new landscape. And I'll speak more to that in a minute. But what have we seen so far with research ethics, both COVID-related studies and non-COVID-related studies, is kind of just a little increase in stress on the participant side. So one thing that the REBs would like the researchers to kind of take into consideration and be aware of is that the pandemic is affecting everybody in strange and different and unusual ways, and to kind of consider that when you're asking the questions, even if they're not related to COVID, they might be going through a very stressful period in their lives, and their responses to the questions may, you may need to take that into consideration and just have that heightened awareness of that. Jen, you can go to the next one. Our current landscape still, even though you can go out and now go shopping to your heart's content, at this point, we still are not approving in-person or face-to-face research. We're still just focusing on remote technologies. We've had a substantial number of amendments to modify in-person methodologies to remote and virtual methods. Having the UBC licensed version of Zoom has definitely helped with that. We've created some guidance for researchers to follow and kind of best practices when using that. Once the curtailment is lifted or modified, methodologies will have to be changed via an amendment. So what we aren't looking for is, right now we'll do interview studies by Zoom. Yeah, 1 second, John. When the curtailment's lifted, we'll do them in person. That's not what we're looking for, because the definition of curtailment could be different. I've had several phone calls already asking, since the government has changed their guidelines around social distancing, does that mean that I can now do my interviews, within 2 people outside and wear a mask? And my answer is no. Until the guidelines are released, again, it's just remote virtual methods. I'll quickly veer off to Jonathan's question. Yes, the CREB and the BREB are prioritizing them both. We try to aim our turnaround times for COVID-related studies to about 5 days, just to ensure that these studies can get up and running, because some of the data that may need to be collected could be only available during a very limited time, even on the behavioral side. Right now, and Paul alluded to it, that there is a task force. There is a task force about behavioral research and clinical research, and how is that movement to in-person potentially going to be done. We have representation on the task force from both the Vancouver campus and the Okanagan campus. Our co-chair, Carolyn, is on that task force. And right now there is no news as to what the changes will be. Again, like Paul mentioned, the main thing is safety. So even though, social distancing has been relaxed right now, we still have to look at the risk-benefit ratio and the safety of the participants is the in-person interviews really needed? How does that affect the safety? Things like that. So again, as Paul mentioned, right now remotely, if you can do it that way, is kind of our standard. There have been, not on our Okanagan campus, but on the Vancouver campus, there has been some instances where in-person research is required. That's more the exception than the norm, and those have to go for full board review and also obtain a higher level approval. So they're not just something that it would be your preference to do interviews. No, it's definitely would be a requirement and have a strong rationale. So next. So yes, continually changing. We're going to start prefacing our review of the studies with kind of the guideline that what we approve today may not be what we're going to permit tomorrow, and depending if a second wave comes and restrictions have to be drawn back in, that what we approve in the summer may not be what's permittable in the fall. So in this ever-changing landscape, just make sure that at whatever stage you and your students are at, is that before you implement or planning, that you just kind of check out what the current guidelines are so that you're working with the most up-to-date information, and don't assume that because the government is saying one thing in regards to how people may go about and do their business, that applies to research at UBC, because that is definitely not the case. And the last are two main slides. I have the one for the behavioral guidance. We have consolidated it onto both campuses for one guidance, so all the information's in one place. There's also similar guidance on the clinical research ethics website, so I apologize for those that are doing clinical research that I don't have that link up there. And the main site about curtailment of research activities, so any information about changing and permitting, say, in-person interviews when the task force has provided their recommendations and the details of that are known, it will be posted there. And then the BREB and the CREB will probably most likely have our own specific guidance to help you through that.
Lisa, could you identify or indicate what's going on with the harmonized review, for example, with our hospital partners, for example, in the Okanagan Interior Health, or within the coastal region at UBC Van, or any other region there, because there's many of them.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Harmonized reviews, of course, are still, they're going through. When it's a harmonized review with a health authority, there have been some challenges, of course, especially if you're wanting to use hospital resources or perhaps interview frontline workers. There always is that operational approval to go through. And I know at Interior Health, they were quite restrictive as to what they were permitting. And also Island Health and Vancouver Coastal Health were even more strict, just because of the pressure that was being put on their frontline workers and nurses and doctors. So they were really limiting the ability to have access to those individuals to interview, and also access to data. They were really kind of prioritizing where they were putting their efforts in. On the Interior Health side, that has relaxed a little bit on the operational side. So some operational approvals are going through a little bit quicker, and they may be considering things that they weren't, say, a month ago.
Thank you. Are there specific questions for Lisa or Carolyn about student interactions with respect to ethics or anything like that?
I see Catherine's question about Zoom.
Perfect.
Yes. If you're using the UBC licensed version of Zoom, which is strongly recommended, then the storage of the recordings is right onto your own personal device, so you don't have to worry about storage of recordings on the cloud. And we do have a document, the Zoom guidance document, that gives you some best practices. If you're conducting a focus group, perhaps with several individuals via Zoom, some instructions to provide people with, and of course some standard wording for the consent form to let them know that even though the recordings are on your own personal device, that Zoom stores personal information as to who's using the software.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay. Not seeing any questions or blue hands. Teresa, do you see a blue hand, or are we good?
I do not see a blue hand.
Okay.
So we'll keep going. But
So
people
we're
can
gonna
always, people can always put a question in the chat and we'll get to it. Yeah. Sorry. Are you ready for me? We've already had the update on research curtailment. So there's just one, I want to talk about not pivoting your own research, but if the research for whatever reason just can't go on right now. So if you're actually having a full-on pause in your research, or more importantly in the students' research, what are some other kinds of activities or approaches or things that a student can do, both in terms of expanding their own research into new forms, or working on other aspects of their professional development? And these are just a few ideas. But one is, we have the Public Scholars Initiative on the UBC Vancouver campus. However, you don't really need to be in the Public Scholars Initiative to do this kind of work. And what it does is it supports students to expand their research, their thesis research, sorry, in this case it's PhD, by finding ways to address their work more overtly to the public good, and engaging with various sectors beyond the university, beyond academics. And so it's a way of broadening scholarship. So some of the examples of the work that students are doing are a project called Citizen Science, where they're sharing mass collections of raw data for people to look at and use in their own research. Figuring out how, if they're studying climate change, how can they take that research a step further and say, how do I engage the community in issues around climate change? Or if they are in psychology, say, I'm assuming this is like a psychology study, and they're looking at mental health issues, and they want to do a more knowledge mobilization project on how spending money actually improves one's own health. And so these kinds of projects can still be done. You can imagine them all being done virtually. And what they do is they extend and broaden the reach of your thesis. So those are things that students could work on now, if they can't actually work on that for some reason on the data set. Other things you can do is, take a pause in your particular dissertation or thesis research, or students can, and engage in a journal club, or write a concept paper for a new study, or design a new research approach to be used at a later date, presenting at online conferences, reflecting on some scientific approach. They could focus a little bit on career exploration, and it may not be academic, it might be non-academic. So what would it mean if I looked a little bit more right now at my career and how to rethink my work in relation to the career I might want to choose? It's always a good time to work on grants and fellowship applications if you're, for instance, a doctoral or postdoctoral application. They'll be coming up pretty soon in the fall. And there's all kinds of other professional development activities. And I was wondering if we go 2 slides forward, you'll see that Jackie Brinkman from our office, there we go, can also just, I think you're there, Jackie, if you could just say a word about the range of resources that are open to both campuses for graduate students in terms of professional development.
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Teresa. So I send my weekly grad update, but just for faculty members to know, there are a ton of online resources available to students. There's online career advising. Both UBC Okanagan and UBCB could access just emailing Danielle Barkley, or going online under career exploration on my website, which is linked there at the top. As well as UBC, we subscribe to the National Center for Faculty Development and Diversity. I'd be curious if any faculty members here are members, but it's actually for faculty members, and you can go online and subscribe, and I sign up for their Monday Motivator emails. It talks about planning for your semesters, strategizing, protecting your research. But they have a lot of resources for graduate students as well, including a 12-week dissertation success curriculum, which is online, on-demand, recorded session just to help students work through developing a writing plan, overcoming procrastination, perfectionism, dealing with writer's block, etc. And then there's also a variety of online individual development plans. These are available widely. My IDP at sciencecareers.org for STEM fields, Imagine PhD for those in the social sciences and humanities, and CIHR has a new one out. And again, if students go through that, they can always debrief their results with peers, with myself, with Danielle Barkley. And as I've put up, the UBCO has their Center for Scholarly Communications. We also have our Writing Center, which currently is doing online writing communities 2 days a week. And Teresa and I have just started, we're starting on June 4th. There's going to be a candidacy to completion writing community for students, and those have been really well subscribed. And in fact, faculty members can as well. So are any of the professional development activities going through Zoom? Some are going through Zoom. Some of the workshops that we've been doing, a couple of the facilitators are more comfortable with Zoom, but in general, Graduate Pathways to Success, and for years before COVID, we've been doing webinars. We use Blackboard Collaborate. UBC approves Blackboard Collaborate. It's FIPPA compliant. And the nice thing about Zoom, or the nice thing about Blackboard Collaborate is if you record the webinars, the chat can be anonymized, which is not something that Zoom has the capacity to do. So it just protects student information more. But that being said, Zoom has functionality that Blackboard doesn't have. So there's pros and cons with each. So I'm doing a session this Thursday. I've chosen to use Zoom just for video, audio, and breakout room capabilities.
Thanks so much, Jackie. Thank you.
Welcome.
There's so many opportunities for students.
And if anyone has any questions anytime, I'll just type my email into the chat. Feel free to reach out if you have questions about particular resources.